nine-page story where the Justice League gangbangs Wonder Woman. It's a pornographic, it's also a story. And it is.
I was going to say let me ink it, but
I have sprayed the pencils, so nobody can ink them and preserve, because they were very smudgy, and I didn't want them to get any smudgier. But it was an absolute magnificent job. It was something. I had this sketchbook that I was passing around to people to draw on, and the first guy who I gave it to, I think it was Don Rico, did a drawing of Captain America with a woman with the clothes half torn off. And the next thing I gave it to my friend Will Minio, and he drew Korak with a woman with all her clothes torn off. And then the next one, it just like everybody was trying to top the one before it. And it turned about page 6 into hardcore porn. And then I gave it to Mike, and he filled it full of like 12 pages or something like that. And he drew this whole Justice League story where they're all fighting over who's going to get Wonder Woman, and they wind up beating each other to death, and Wonder Woman is lying there naked, going, "Oh, I guess I'll have to do it myself." Okay. Anyway, it's quite okay. But so I had to start another sketchbook. I couldn't hand that one to Karl Marx. You know? So I got the clean book and the dirty book. Anyway. Do you have any questions for these men about ink? You've got three of the best people in the business up here right now, so you must have questions. Yes?
But sometimes when pencilers and inkers get together, there's magic, and that's happened with each of you. So a two-part question. Were you surprised the first time it happened? And did you ever expect it to happen, and it didn't happen?
Okay. You follow the question? Let's take it one step at a time here. Mike, one day, someone, and it was me, handed me your first Jack Kirby story today. It was a New Gods. All right? And Jack said, "Go over it with him. Tell him how to do it." And I went through it. I said, "Well, ink this really good, and then ink this page really good. I think I'm going to tell Mike what to do." I went through this charade of like pretending to give him some. Now here right here, you probably want to set that figure on. And it came back, and it was magnificent. It's an issue of New Gods. It was just wonderful. And I felt very proud in my role of shoehorning you in. And DC was ready. DC was just dying for it to stink. They were just dying to say, "Oh, Jack, we can't have you do the inking done out there by your guy. We've got to have it done back here by our guy." And Mike showed them all up. And I'll mention one other thing here. I say this a lot because I think it's important. When Jack wanted to have his own inker locally in Southern California, and an inker who would work for him and not for DC, Mike was not only the best choice, Mike was the only choice. It was just at that point we didn't know anybody else. And we had to have somebody letter the books. Well, Mike happens to be a fabulous letterer. So it was like if we had to invent the perfect person. Then Mike had necessary skills. He could letter the books, and he could ink the books very, very well. But there was another thing here, which was that New York hated the idea of loss of control. And they wanted to see him fail. And they were hoping that he would just not meet the deadlines and would not get the books done. And eventually they'd go, "See, Jack, you can't hire an inker. We've got to pick the inker. We've got to have the work done by us, our people here." And Mike missed, exactly how many deadlines did you ever miss on those books?
0.
Right. And this is a matter of penciling, of inking as fast as Jack Kirby penciled and lettering it. Both Joe Sinnott and Frank Giacoia told me they were impressed with the quality of Mike's work. And these are guys who understood Jack Kirby inking. But also they said, does he have like a staff of guys helping him? Because they could not have done the volume of work and met those deadlines, and neither of them could have lettered it. And you had how many people helping?
Well, when I wanted to have some time with my wife and kids, D. Bruce Berry did some backgrounds on some buildings in a book once. And in A Demon once, William Stout did backgrounds. Otherwise, and one issue, I had somebody letter it. And in fact, someone showed me an original yesterday from that book, and I said, did I ink this? Because the lettering threw me off. It like, Anyway, I grew up with Simon and Kirby comic books, and I didn't know who was Simon and who was Kirby until many years later, but I could always tell when there was a story that to me felt like it all came from one man's hand. And it turned out those were the times that Jack was inking his own pencils. And in the 60s, I would see the occasional rare page of his pencils published in a fanzine, and I always would aloud say, why isn't anybody inking Jack? That was my feeling that everyone was putting too much of their own personality into it. And my whole career was luck. I met Alex Toth, became a good friend, and then I get a call from Jack, and he says, Mike Royer, Alex Toth says you're a pretty good inker. So if I hadn't ingratiated myself into Alex's society, that may never have happened. And Jack called me to his house to ink his biography piece for Marvel Mania, where he's sitting at the drawing board and all the characters are swirling around. And I said, okay, I'll have it for you tomorrow. And he says, no, he says, just do it here. So I sat at his drawing board, and fortunately I always carried a kit of my tools with me, ink and brushes and razor blades for corrections. I learned that from Joe Kluber. And I sat there at his drawing board where every 20 minutes he'd come in and look over my shoulder. But I got to meet the family and homemade sandwiches with Roz. And Mark explained to me the other day the reason that Jack had me do it there is he wanted to know that it came from my hand, not someone else helping me, and how I would work under pressure. And I guess I passed the test, because in the next year or so, I inked an awful lot of stuff of Jack's. And then finally, when DC acquiesced and said, well, let the kid do it, I was so delighted, because when he left Marvel to go to DC, I was supposed to be part of the package.
And I think DC was very disappointed that they couldn't say, oh, Jack, you screwed up here, you hired the wrong kid. They were waiting for you to fail, and you didn't.
Well, Roz would tease me after my first issues of the Fourth World books came out. She said, I'm getting all these letters from people saying, who the hell is this Royer?
He's changing Jack's work too much.
And actually, the generation that embraced Jack's Marvel comic books had never seen, well, on rare occasions, undiluted Jack Kirby. Now, people have asked me, what was the difference, basic difference between Mike Royer and Joe Sinnott? And I love Joe Sinnott's work. First discovered his work as a kid in a free Buster Brown comic book at the store, you know. If you are familiar with the dichotomy of the motion picture studios in the Golden Age, Joe Sinnott inked Jack Kirby, MGM. I inked Jack Kirby, Warner Brothers. From the first time I met Jack, I knew he loved Warner Brothers.
Is that why everybody looked like Ruby Keeler in your town?
No, that's when I learned, well, I learned first from Doug Wiley and then from Jack, that all the women that drew with their wife was their wife.
And most of the men Jack drew were him. John, what was the question? The question again, we lost it. We lost the question.
The pairing.
Oh, pairing, again.
Yeah,
I'm perfectly cast for this job.
well, I think Mike Zeck and I did that, you know, and Mike was still growing as a penciler, and I was trying to catch up, you know, with the inking, and I think we finally, you know, connected at some point, had a nice run. I guess, you know, Mike and I are still,
You did a lot of pages.
yeah, and, but there were.
Can you look at those pages now and see, oh, here I added this, I added this, there must have been places where you kind of took over a little bit in terms of, maybe even not on figures so much as lighting and.
Yeah, there were.
You always had really good like light sources in your past.
Well-
You always seemed to be very cognizant of where the light was coming from and how the light would enhance the key parts of the drawing and like punch them out. Because it read, I remember your pages read real well at a distance. It was very clean and there was no faking of.
Right.
Because everybody cheats occasionally.
Yeah.
You look at a lot of anchors go, I don't know what he was drawing, I'll just, put a lot of lines in.
Mike always was, you know, not like the pencilers of today, but he gave you enough that you understood what, he was telling you, but he didn't give you so much as you couldn't kind of, you know, put your own style to it. So that's what I liked about Mike's pencils a lot, is, you know, there was room to move a bit on. And so, yeah, there were times where, you know, and Mike would let me know if I took it too far, you know, in one direction, or if
Did
it
he
was
ever
right.
take the pages and do re-inking things?
No, he would, actually, I was lucky enough to, when Mike moved to Connecticut, I would go like twice a year and stay with him for 4 or 6 weeks, and we'd work on stuff. And so if he saw something he didn't like, he'd say, nah, do that over. And had electric erasers back then, you know, remember?
Yeah.
And, you know, and I'd erase it off.
And
And
the paper could handle it.
it could handle it. The paper was good, and you know, you could erase little mistakes and stuff a couple of times and maybe rework them before it got too bad. But it was a growing experience, and like I said, there came a point where maybe in the, like towards the end, well, after Secret Wars and going into the Punisher, I think we really, you know, got the Secret Wars stuff out, and a lot of that was patchwork that it was done because of deadlines and stuff, or something changed in the story. But after that, we kind of, you know, I think we were determined to like really not let that happen again. But unfortunately, deadlines do come up and things change. But for the most part, like I said, that connection does happen, and when it does, it's really a good feeling. You know, it's like magic. And so there are those pencilers I think you click with.
All right. Pencilers that you feel you really clicked with from the start?
You know, listening to John and Mike, I would, you know, my feeling is that you get better with time. And the first jobs I did over Frank Miller wasn't particularly great. The first jobs I did over Gil Kane weren't great. But given time, you learn to figure it out. And yeah, please tell me. Yeah.
I remember the first time if I'm remembering this correctly, I remember the first time you had one of Frank's jobs. I liked it. I liked the later ones better, but I didn't, you know, you just, I don't know if it was Frank or you or whatever was happening. Obviously, both of you were growing in the relationship.
Yeah.
But the first one with me looked absolutely fine. It's just, you know, and I was impressed with it, and I was impressed with the next one and the next one. And at that point, if I'm remembering this correctly, and I haven't looked at these for a long time, Joe Rosen was lettering.
Yeah, sure.
He was writing his
We
very
love
small lettering.
Yeah.
But I felt like there was something, it's like the lettering didn't quite go in the art for me and it grew on me. And then maybe that's one of the things I was appreciating is, I think he lettered all of those.
Most of them,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
certainly toward the end.
And, you know, I think Marvel had some really bad letterers at that time. He was not one of the bad letterers.
No, he was, the reason why Joe Rosen, why Frank and I both loved Joe Rosen is because he letters small. So there was more room for the art. And it's funny that you mentioned Joe, because Frank mentions Joe a lot as his favorite letterer.
Well, I think there was also, you know, there's always something about, I have a lot of beliefs about balloon placement. And I think, and how, I don't understand why some people who place balloons haven't figured out that you don't tuck the balloon behind the head of someone in the background and overlap it with someone in the foreground, throw the whole plane off of what it is.
Does the artist usually choose balloon?
Well, it depends on a lot of things. Sometimes the writer is placing the balloons. And I happen to think that whatever else we think of Stanley's writing, I think he was the lousiest balloon placer in history comics. And a lot of guys just, they don't understand that the artist is creating, you know, a diorama kind of. There's something, various things are in front of each other. And you flatten the drawing out in subtle ways by overlapping a balloon with somebody or putting it behind their heads or in front of their heads. And it's very confusing sometimes if you look back and go, wait a minute, if you had to construct this like a shadow box, which layer is this on? It becomes like a Mobius, no, not Mobius, who's the guy with all the different MC Escher, you know, it becomes like things are, wait a minute, now this is behind this and it's in front of it. Now Escher did it intentionally, but there are people without even thinking would do that. They'd flatten out your drawings. But Rosa didn't do that. I guess, was Frank placing the balloons?
He was.
Okay, so there you are. Frank understood the drawing.
But you know what you're talking about, Mark, if I may say, in a larger concept or concept, is that, you know, we look at lettering as something that seems simple, and it's not. And it's the same thing with inking and penciling and writing and lettering and coloring. These things are very, very complicated, and the ability to produce a comic book that works is really hard. It's very difficult. And the ability to produce a comic book that's really good is almost impossible. So I'm always amazed at how civilians look at the craft that is involved in producing a comic book. It's not easy. There's a lot of, you know, it's complicated, even something like lettering.
Yeah, I was, as you figure, I'm a big, tremendous comic book fan, and I decided at some point to embrace the fact that I wasn't necessarily a fan of Superman or Batman or Spider-Man. I was a fan of Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby and the various people, and I was always fascinated with how they did what they did, and I kept thinking, well, why is this done this way? Why is this? And sometimes you discover they were in a hurry. There's no reason. They just did it because the book had to go out. And it's amazing how many things went right in a lot of good comic books. When you see how fast they were, you know, there's an awful lot of Marvel comics in the 60s. The question is like, well, why did they have this guy do this? Well, he needed work that day. You know, why is there an issue of Sergeant Fury, Dick Ayer's pencil was inked by Steve Ditko? Because, you know, the Doctor Strange he was supposed to ink next hadn't come back from the letterer, so they didn't want Ditko to go away with the work, so they handed him his book. And some of these things worked and some of them didn't. But they weren't done intentionally usually. An awful lot of inkers were assigned by accident. That's why on a lot of Marvel books in the 60s, if you look at the original art, on the first page, the inker's name is on whiteout because somebody else was, when they lettered the book, they had somebody that was scheduled with somebody else, and 2 days later, it went to a different guy, so they had to go back and fix the lettering credits, or the inking credits. And sometimes they didn't, which is why Frank Giacoya's Fantastic Writing number 5, he inked it, and it still says Joe Sinnott. They never got around to changing the name. Things of that sort. Another question, yes, sir.
Yeah, just real quick, you guys have any warm-up exercises or anything you guys like to
Warm-up
do before you-
exercises. That's an interesting question.
What was the question?
Warm-up exercises. Oh, and another question, okay? You're given a job to ink. You start on page 1 and go straight through, or do you move around? You jump around?
I've learned that working sequentially is the best thing to do. And as far as a warm-up, I'll warm up doing backgrounds. That's my warm-up. But working sequentially, I know an inker, and probably John and Mike knows who this is, who used to ink just the stuff that he liked doing. And then he would leave all the stuff that he hated doing for the end. And he's no longer working.
Well, the way Russ Manning worked, and I did until I went to work for Jack, was he would pencil a whole book, and then he would ink a panel here, go to the next page, ink a panel. And he said by doing it that way, when it was finished, if he had a bad day, those panels were spread out through the book. But I couldn't do that with Jack because no way could I have done 3 pages a day. It just wouldn't have worked. But I was lucky. I worked with 2 master storytellers, visual storytellers. And whenever I lettered someone else's book, if I didn't like where the balloon was because it screwed up the design of the page and its visual storytelling and flow, I would adjust it. I used to take balloons that Jack had put all the dialogue in one big bubble, and I'd break it up like a movie script, that a line of dialogue, beat, meaning pause. And so I would do my pauses by moving, still and occupying the same area. And I always liked to do things that took a little longer, but I would rule my guidelines for the first balloon, and then the next balloon that was next to it, I'd make sure that they weren't on the same level. and I felt that they read more comfortably that way. But that's just my way of doing it. That didn't answer the question, but.
Did Mr. Kirby notice or mine? Did Mr. Kirby notice or mine when you changed it? Did he have
I'm
time?
sorry.
Did he notice that you changed the pacing of the balloons?
Some people noticed. Jack, I'm sure that Jack noticed it, but I think Jack realized that I didn't harm it. I might have plussed it. Sometimes, one of my favorite splash pages is Hyman. He had this stuff all across the top of the page. I put a box here, moved here, and to me, when it was colored, the page just gelled better. And I think Jack understood what I was doing was not to make it any easier for me, but to make the finished product look even better, or hopefully better.
Well, Jack was happy with about 99.5% of everything you did. So that's a pretty good track record.
Well, I'll never forget his
Yes.
phone call with Mr. Miracle number 5. Don't ever change the faces, because I made Barta's face a little prettier on the splash page. And so he fixed that by taking his photocopied stuff at home and pasting it over. But what Jack never noticed is that I would occasionally thin her ankle a little bit and maybe a wrist, but I learned never change the faces. And he was right. And I remember in his Jimmy Olsen's that I called DC and I said, please send me the model sheets. So if you have to have Jimmy Olsen and Superman's faces redrawn, at least they will be redrawn and then inked by the person that inked all the rest of the page.
Yeah, that's true. John, is there, what was the goal?
The warm-up.
Yeah, warm-up.
I'm pretty much like Klaus. I'll fill in blacks on pages or do background work, stuff that, doesn't maybe need as much,
Focus.
yeah, mindset to get it, you can kind of noodle around. Backgrounds, get your hand, get your mind, get everything working, and then start on the main figure stuff.
A lot of old-time inkers, like Frank Giacoya, guys like that, the way they approach a story they got is they go and they ink the bottom tiers. So then they weren't worried about smudging the pencils, and they worked on the top tiers. So they kind of ink up. They start at the bottom of the page and work upward. And they ink up, bottom tier on page 2, let it, while it was drying, they ink the bottom page, tier on page 3, and so on like that.
I think Klaus said something that the light bulb went off, is I would warm up doing backgrounds.
Okay, good.
And you kind of ease into, right, the figures.
Well, you also, I think, did it, in some cases, might have ultimately done a better job of inking the characters in the foreground and deciding on their line weights because you'd already established the background. I was a character art manager at Disney in my last couple of years, and it was my job, because of my background, to use outside inkers. And I always said the same thing repeatedly, and usually they didn't understand. All the inking was done by people on the light board, and I kept saying, remember, the line defines the form.
Good. All right, well, we're going to end this here. I found this enormously informative. I'm amazed how informative this is. I hope you all learned something about this.
That's right.
Would you join me in thanking Mr. John Beatty?
And you guys have booth numbers and what you guys are doing today?
Yes. Where will they find you? Where will they find you, Mike?
AA 502. My table is covered in poo.
John?
AA 707.
If you want to find me, just go to Sergio and turn left.